And as promised today, we've got our newest school committee member, Dimitry Ansalme. And as you may know, Sharon Abramowitz resigned and moved to Vermont before her moving across the world for her career. And the school committee and the select board, vote a new member, and Dimitri's their guy. And so I'm really excited to introduce us today to school committee member Dimitry Ansalme. Dimitry, thank you so much for being here with us today.
Well, thank you. Thank you. It's a pleasure to be with you. I'm excited to be on the school committee and to be serving the town. So I am looking forward to the conversation with you and with your viewers and listeners.
And look, you know, most school committee members go through the election process, and so voters and the rest of the town have an opportunity to get to know them a little bit. But for many of us, you're new on the scene. Where have you been all my life, Dimitry? What have you been up to? Tell us, you know, a little bit of background. What motivates you? Where your expertise lie? All that sort of stuff. Tell us about you.
Sure. So I have always been in Brookline, actually. I have moved and lived in Brookline 10 years ago when I brought my children to Brookline because I wanted them to go to the schools. So my youngest went from kindergarten on, he's at the high school now, and my oldest was in first grade. However, prior to that, in the 90s, I was teaching at the high school. I taught in Brookline for 5 years, and I also was part of the freshman campus at the time. We had developed this idea of creating a freshman campus at Old Lincoln. So I taught there and then left Brookline High School to go work at Facing History. And then the other funny thing about Brookline is that most of my life, I've actually worked in Brookline. You know, I am originally from Haiti, but the family was living in the Congo, Africa, and then we immigrated to the U.S. So I'm an immigrant to the U.S. And we lived in Boston, in Hyde Park, and I went to high school, Catholic high school in the South End. However, while I was in high school, I had a part-time jobs on the weekend, and my part-time job was in Brookline. So I used to work at the old International House of Pancake, which stood where the Stop and Shop on Harvard Street stands today. So, you know, I think I started working there in 86 or 87, something like that. So yeah, all the jobs I've had have been in the town of Brookline, from my time as a young immigrant to today.
And I will say, you know, we'll deviate a little bit. I don't know if you remember Chris Dempsey or Ben Franco, who I know were both at Old Lincoln for 9th grade. Maybe you remember them when they were youngsters.
Chris Dempsey rings a bell. But yeah, it's been a while. So you know.
I didn't know him then, but I'll bet you he was tall, thin, and had a deep voice even back then. More recently, you've been very involved with Facing History. And I know some viewers are quite familiar with that organization, but others, this is the first time they're hearing about it. So maybe you can walk us through where it came from, your involvement in it, but also, you know, what it is striving to accomplish.
Sure. So, you know, Facing History is, again, another amazing Brookline story. So Facing History is an amazing educational global nonprofit today. We write curriculum on history and we offer teacher training. We do a lot of work, and a lot of our curriculum is around the study of the Holocaust and other genocides. So the Holocaust, Armenian genocide, Cambodian, and we have materials on Rwanda. We have materials on US history, particularly looking at the fragility of democracy and moments of fracture. So we study this. We have materials looking at the civil rights movement. We have materials looking at the Reconstruction period, which is the period right after the Civil War in US history, when we had a multiracial democracy, which is taken down after 12 years through a lot of really terrorist acts of violence around the country to keep Black and poor white voters away from the polls, and brought back a regime of segregation and racial separation. So we have materials along those lines, and then we have a lot of materials looking at issues of human rights on a global stage. So looking at apartheid, looking at issues of human rights in Northern Ireland, and particularly looking at societies in transitions that are attempting to build or rebuild democratic transitions. So Facing History is serving at this point. We have a network of over 300 educators in the US and globally. We believe that we've touched, it's hard to count, but we believe we're touching close to 2 to 3 million of students every year, just in terms of the volume of teachers we serve and help. So it's quite an impressive, but it's all Brookline. It's a Brookline institution. People forget that. So Facing History started in Brookline in 1976. It was a program in the Brookline Public Schools, where Brookline Public Schools at the time had allowed for 2 teachers, Margot Strum and Bill, who went to a conference paid by the town on the study and teaching of the Holocaust in 1976. And they came back. They were so moved by what they were learning and felt that it would be really critical and important in the later years of the 20th century that kids and students in Brookline should study the history of the Holocaust and think deeply about its implications. So they developed the Facing History program as a program in Brookline Public Schools. Then they were able to get some federal funding and they expanded from there. They went to Arlington, Cambridge, Boston, and then poof, it really grew and eventually became an independent nonprofit. So away from the Brookline schools and then moved on. So now, 40 years later, it has 6 offices in the United States, an office in Canada, in Toronto, an office in the UK, and then we do work globally. So we are in China. I started a project in China about 10 years ago. We work in Hong Kong and China mainland. With both private and public Chinese public schools. We work in Northern Ireland. We work in France. I manage a project in France. So I lived in France for about 2 or 3 years ago. I took the kids out for a year out of schools in Brookline, and we moved to France because I was managing a project there, combating anti-Semitism and racism in the context of France. We work in Germany, in Poland. We work in South Africa, Kenya. So we have quite a global presence now, and it all started here in Brookline.
Well, and sadly, genocide is a global phenomenon, right? And so the lessons there are close to home in some sense all over the world. I wonder, has the murder of George Floyd and the subsequent angst and protest in the U.S., has that amped up Facing History or drawn additional interest, called for you to refocus a little bit? How has Facing History adapted to the past few months of the Black Lives Matter movement?
Yeah, increased demand. I mean, I don't think we've had to refocus. This is our focus. This is what we do. This is the work. And I think teachers who use Facing History know that. So many teachers come to us whenever there have been moments of acts of violence, what we call the democratic fracture, moments whenever there's a moment where the social fabric is being ruptured. Teachers know to come to Facing History. So they go to the website or they call our model, you have a program associate who works with your schools, and immediately they'll contact the person to get resources. We usually have resources, both current event resources or things on how do you navigate difficult conversation in your classroom. We've created a civil discourse guide for, again, how do you develop civil discourse in your classroom and so on, because the country needs it. But the country has always needed it. Living and being in a democracy is hard. You will hear multiplicity of voices, multiplicity of values and perspective and visions. And we, especially as Americans, we take it for granted, right? And because in some ways we have that muscle, so we sometimes exercise it without thinking of it. So that's our work. And I would say with what's happened since the spring and through the summer, which has been very violent with issues of police brutality, we have had a lot of calls because teachers have been looking for resources and for ways to understand where we are, what's the historical framework, and also understanding the contemporary issues. we've seen a record number of attendance of all of our work. We do a lot of work on issues of race and equity and so on. We have seen huge demand for our resources on the website with creating digital resources for teachers. So I would say the George Floyd and everything that's been happening since spring, has brought us, new people have come to know us, but the folks who know us and use our materials are consistently turning to us to help them in this particular moment. I think we're, I think if I'm an historian, so I know that we've had other moments that are probably even harder than what we're going through at the moment and what we went through the summer. So I keep that perspective, but we are hurting. We are hurting. We're going through challenging moments in terms of understanding which American values do we want to hold on to, which American values do we want to preserve, and potentially what do we want to change.
Well, and I'll never miss an opportunity to point out that one moment that we as American citizens have, or most American citizens have, frankly, is on Election Day. That is November 3rd. It is a Tuesday. You can vote by mail still, although we're running out of time. You can take your ballot, right? It looks like this. Fill it out, and you can bring it to Town Hall, slide it in. If you have not requested a ballot, you can still go to Town Hall and vote in person early. And of course, you can vote on Election Day, Tuesday, November 3rd. Polls are open 7 a.m. until 8 p.m. Whatever the way that works for you to get that vote locked in, I encourage you, if you have the right to vote in this country, that you exercise that right this election and all others. But starting with this one, we know it's a big one. So thank you for that opportunity to make that point. I think it's of course a critical one. More recently, Dimitry, you found yourself on the school committee, which is a bit like running toward several fires at once. Look, we know it's a really challenging circumstance prior to COVID, enrollment and school building and teacher contract, and now, oh my gosh, how do we keep everyone safe? How do we keep kids learning? How do we relearn how to teach kids from kindergarten all the way up through 12th grade with a variety of different needs? And you were like, yeah, that sounds like I could probably squeeze that into my schedule. So tell us the thinking process for you and why school committee makes sense for you at this moment in time.
Thank you. It was a sense of duty. I mean, I think there are a couple of things. I think because of this COVID moment, we are all of us in town are deeply thinking about what is good education. How do you deliver education remotely to students? What is best for young kids? I'm thinking about elementary kids versus high school kids. And then we are also thinking about the challenges of teaching in moments when we have to socially distance. I think in a society that has a history of racial marginalization and exclusion of a variety of groups, you always want to be very careful whenever that society has to socially distance, because the potential for us to do the social distance by drawing on really difficult, I want to say bad historical practices is always there, right? So the danger of that is always there. But I think in a town like Brookline, for which we have always valued inclusion, it seems to me that this is an amazing challenge to figure out how do we do school in this particular context. We want to socially distance, but we want to include, and we want to be bringing all of our kids and young people to sort of ideals and values that we hold dear in the town. So it sounded to me like an exciting call of duty to do it at the moment. I have to confess that I thought when I saw the notice, I was like, oh, I don't have to run for an election. So it's actually easier. It's just I'll be appointed and I'll go in and I'll serve. But, it's also because of COVID. I really wanted to do something that was meaningful where I live in a town. Brookline has been an amazing town to me. My children have had an amazing, amazing educational experience, especially as two young Black men in this system. So I wanted to give back. I think this is a way for me to say thank you to the town and to give back. The days are long, it's a lot of work, but I'm loving it. And as I've said to you, I'm at the core, I am an immigrant. I'm still learning American society. So the idea that I, as an ordinary citizen, can sit on the school committee and be thinking about budgets and union and how do we make sure that we have a good teacher contract and what good curriculum do we need and do we need new buildings? It's amazing to me that we can do this as citizens. Like, again, for most Americans, this is sort of, this is in the water. This is what you do. No, this is amazing to me that as an ordinary citizen, I can make these kind of decisions or be part of that process. So I'm incredibly
I will
grateful.
tell you that I am not an immigrant. I was born in Connecticut. My parents were born in the U.S. My grandparents were born primarily overseas. But I share that same, like, really? Folks are asking me to help? Like,
Yeah.
and I can just say, sure, I'm in. And it was like, that's cool, go for it, right?
Yeah.
And being part of it. And, it's this combination of joy, but also pressure and seriousness. People are relying on, frankly, on folks like you and I to do the best we can and to get it as close to right as we can. We're never going to get it perfect, right?
Yep.
But it's a really wonderful feeling, and it's incredibly motivating. So I totally get that, and that's not unique to immigrants who are in office. But I think it's even more exciting, and I think there's even more beauty to the story that way. And I hope that I hope folks back in Haiti and the Congo are pulling for you and inspired somehow or other.
Thank
To
you.
say nothing of,
Yeah.
frankly, folks in Brookline who should be inspired by you and your story.
Well,
So you're on the
you.
school
Thank you.
committee, and you've been there, I don't know, a couple of weeks, a couple of months, not long.
I think it's coming close
I
to a
think you're
month.
probably just starting to get your feet wet.
I am, yeah.
Close to a month. And so are you on any subcommittees yet? And which ones, and how is that going?
Yeah, so I have joined the finance subcommittee, and then I've joined the policy review subcommittee. And then I'm taking on a couple of liaisons roles around the town. So I'm getting my feet wet slowly around it. I mean, I had already a good sense of some of the issues happening in schools in the town, and particularly with the schools. I have I have a good sense of folks who are working in the schools or what some of the issues are. I read, the press regularly, so I had a good sense. But it's been really good to be part of the school committee. I've been really briefed, and we're able to quickly come up to some of the issues we're facing as a town. We are in an interestingly critical period, right? We are responding to the crisis of COVID, which we have to do, but then we also have to manage it fiscally responsibly. But at the same time, we have to also focus on the future. What's going to happen in this town post-COVID? What kind of schools do we want? What's the quality of education that we want to make sure that students in Brookline receive? How do we preserve good teachers in the system? And how do we continue to cultivate and invite others to join this amazing, again, like I said, Brookline created Facing History because we bring innovative educators to town and work and do that. So that's the spirit you want to create. You want to create multiple Facing Histories to come out of the school system here.
So I want to just dive a little bit into finance. I don't imagine that most viewers understand the absurdities of finance in this particular moment, right? So in every other year in the last, say, 100 years, right, the state passed a budget right by June 30th or soon thereafter, and that includes Chapter 70 money, which tells the cities and towns how much funding they're getting from the state. Similarly, town meeting will have passed a budget incorporating that information, or at least their best guess of that information. And so the school committee on July 1 has a really good idea of how much money they have to spend over the course of the next year, right, which happens to be the next academic year. And can do a pretty good job managing. Sometimes, enrollment changes at the last minute and need to move a little bit around, but it's pretty stable. But this year, there is no state budget. The town budget came in late, not able to respond to a state budget. We had the CARES Act coming out of Congress, which everyone knew was not enough. And here we have not passed a second stimulus. Maybe we'll get one before November 3rd, although that's looking unlikely. It seems that the Senate is much more interested in confirming a Supreme Court justice than funding the 50 states, the 351 cities and towns in Massachusetts. And so maybe Joe Biden gets elected, and then maybe there's a Democratic Senate as well, and maybe there's a stimulus in late January, early February 2021, right? And so figuring out how to budget for this year, where staffing is all over the map and where enrollment is down, but the demands on teachers are up. I'm glad we got you, buddy. Tell us, how are we going to make it through it? What are the challenges sort of this week, this month, the rest of this year, and how do you think they play out with respect to finance and our public schools in Brookline?
Yeah. Tommy, I have not attended yet a finance subcommittee meeting, so I think I will hold back and maybe we'll join you later on in a couple of months when I have a better sense of it. But I think you've already listed some of our challenges, right? So enrollment is down, and yet we have quite a number of costs that we have to meet. We have to run the schools, and teaching in a remote area means that you have to provide educators with the resources. We have to make sure that those school buildings are totally safe, that we have safe practices, and that we can make sure and ensure that our students will be safe, and the teachers and the adults working with them would also be safe and healthy, right? So that we are incurring costs for that. And then remote teaching or teaching in a COVID environment means that we also have additional needs for paraprofessionals and other people to support the work that the classroom educators are doing. So these are also other costs that we are facing. So I think the challenge for the town is going to be, how do we manage and respond to the moment, to the crisis? And so, yes, that will come at a particular painful cost, but also not lose sight of the quality of education we want to see in town post-COVID. My sense is it's probably too early for me to give you a full sense of it, but these are the challenges. And again, I think you've listed the full challenges, both at the state level and so on, not knowing the full picture of it. But again, I'm confident that we'll find the solutions to it. But this is also an opportunity for us to begin a civic conversation in town about, new ways that we may want to begin to reimagine education. And again, lay the ground for that.
Certainly more conversations to come. I've just got a minute left, and I want to know, look, I get that every school committee member cares about all the parts of the job and all of the components, but as unique individuals, every school committee member has things that are particularly interesting to them, places where their experiences or their skill set is the natural fit. So have you yet sort of stumbled upon or knew in advance, what are the parts of the school committee domain where you're leaning forward, where you're like raring to go, you're full of ideas, you're really excited to get involved in?
So I'm very excited about sort of the whole piece around sort of just how do we make sure that we recruit, sustain, and invite good teachers in the system, because I think that's really key. So I'm excited about that, and I'm looking forward to sort of be part of those conversations. I think the town and the school system and school leaders and educators have made an amazing commitment to issues of equity and how do we develop anti-racist education and curriculum. So I'm excited about that, and I want to see this. And I believe that the effort that we're doing at remote instruction is incredibly exciting. We ought to be learning from it. We ought not to be thinking of it as just a response to the moment. I think remote digital learning teaching has a lot to offer. And I'm so glad that we're piloting so much things and we are learning. And I would want to see what of this experience we want to preserve and keep moving forward.
Well, Dimitry Ansalme, newest member of the school committee, thank you for joining us here on Brookline Interactive Group, here on TV, as we call the show. Delighted that you've got your feet wet, delighted that you're working so hard on behalf, not just of our school children, but really of the town at large. And we're pulling for you. Thanks for coming
Thank
on the
you.
show, and we'll see you around.
Great. Thank you, Tommy. Have a good day.